All right, so at this point, our notes for chapter 17 should be passed out. Before we start our notes, though, I do have just a quick little website we're going to share or talk about, but really more so just to talk about a word or term that we haven't quite discussed for a while. We talked about this at the beginning of the school year. And we're going to kind of revisit this word. And again, it's been a few months, so it's nice to just kind of refresh our memory on what exactly this word means. So at the beginning of the school year, we talked about the difference between a scientific hypothesis and a scientific theory. And we talked about how our everyday use of the word theory often means just an untested hunch or some sort of guess that doesn't really have a lot of evidence that supports it. And really, our everyday use of the word theory is not correct. It's definitely more of a loose term of a hypothesis. I have a theory that the Lions are going to win the Super Bowl. That's absolutely not a theory. So, if anything, that's a hypothesis that is going to even be difficult to test. Um, and as we all know, unfortunately, is very likely to not be true. So, in science, however, a theory has a completely opposite meaning. So, a theory is something that has a well substantiated explanation, and it can explain our natural world, and it involves a lot of laws and facts and observations that we have. Gravity, for example, is a popular example of a theory which explains why things fall to the ground. Gravity can be tested. You can continue to throw things up in the ground up in the air, over and over and over again. And what do you know? They always fall to the ground. So what we're going to be covering here over the next few weeks is another theory of science called the theory of evolution. And this theory is going to explain why we have so many plants and animals that exist in our world, and why some of these plants and animals are very similar to each other. So they have a lot of commonalities between each other. However, some are very different from each other. And we're also going to see how this theory can explain why some living things that exist on Earth now were also found in the past, however, just in a different form. They just looked maybe a little bit different. Now, the notes that we're going to do today are going to just kind of lightly touch base on what exactly the theory of evolution is. We're going to go more in depth into how that theory works and what the theory says in a little bit. Today, though, is more so on the history of the development of this theory. So, who was the scientist that formed the theory of evolution? And here we go, make this a little bit more focused here for you. And kind of why was that important? And who were the people at the time that influenced him to develop this theory? And how was the thinking of the time quite different than Darwin's theory, which is why it was kind of challenging for the world at the time. So tomorrow, we'll look at all, and really over these next coming weeks, we're going to look at all of the scientific evidence. So what have we found both back in the day as well as now that supports this theory? So all the different evidence that we have that says this theory follows what happens in the world of science, and just exactly how the theory works. And it's a very simple theory to kind of understand. But a little bit about our scientists here. So this is going to be looking at the big ideas in chapter 17. and more so the earlier parts of 17, like section 1 here. But our scientist that is going to be the star of the show over the next few weeks, his name is Charles Darwin. Now, he was born back in the 1800s into a wealthy family. This was a time before genetics, our understanding of genetics, and actually this was around in a time where really just science started to become a thing. There wasn't a whole, while we had some random people here and there that were coming up with new discoveries in our world, a lot of people at the time, before like the late 17, early 1800s, weren't quite following the field of what we call good science. So coming up with a hypothesis, testing it, etc. So Darwin was one of kind of those first people around that time, maybe not the first, but one of the more known people around that time to really put a lot of effort into his work, we'll say. Sorry, a little sidetrack there, but in college, Darwin himself initially planned to follow a medical career, realized he couldn't really handle blood. So he changed his major to divinity, which is a field of religion. So he wanted to study religion. Actually, his wife happened to be a very religious person. In 1831, he joined a 5-year scientific expedition on the survey ship HMS, so Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. And it was literally a trip around the world. So they went around the world, looking at all of the different areas in the world, developing maps, collecting specimens, living things that existed on different continents. And it was to collect information for the leaders at the time. And after spending 20 years developing an evolutionary theory after his observations on his expedition, we give Charles Darwin the homage as being the father of evolution. So he obviously didn't make evolution. However, he was the one to put evolution into simple terms for everyone to understand and was able to point out that, hey, evolution was actually happening. Now, at the time, his theory was considered very radical and drastic. And we'll find out why due to the way in which people thought during the time. And so part of what helped to influence him to develop his theory is the help of other scientists who also had what were considered radical ideas, challenging ideas at the time. Now, in short, all evolution is it's a process in which modern organisms, so living things that exist today, they have come from ancient organisms that no longer exist now. And evolution also says that living things, they change over time. And really, this here is kind of the big idea here, is that living things change over time. A prime example of this, of quick evolution, is our COVID-19 virus. We started off with the one that we were way concerned about 2 years ago, and now it has evolved, it has changed into new variants over time. So, why was his theory considered radical? And what made it fairly revolutionary for the time? So, at the time, back in the 1800s, again, this was around the time when really good science was actually starting to happen. And before, we had plenty of people that were making discoveries in what we'd call the field of science. But a lot of people were very hesitant to publish ideas or to actually even participate in science, because back at the time, many scientific beliefs included religion. Religion was the main explanation for why the world was the way it was, religious texts. And so in the earlier years, the church would actually punish, whether it be throw into jail, or for a lot of people in the like 15, 16, even 1700s, they would even kill for challenging the church. And so a lot of scientific beliefs at the time did involve religious texts, religious explanations. In Europe, Christianity, or denominations of Christianity, was the more common religion. So that's kind of the reference that we're going to use now. Obviously, there's plenty of other religions in the world, but this was around where Darwin was, the common religion at the time. And Earth was believed to only be a few thousand years old, and absolutely nothing had changed over time. So everything was made at the time of creation and stayed exactly the same since then. Now, at the time, scientists and even just people, don't even necessarily want to necessarily use the word scientists, but just people in general, they started to uncover and find curious things in the ground that we call fossils today. So they were seeing these creatures that were dead, that no longer existed, weren't found anywhere in the world. And they started to wonder, okay, how exactly did these things get here? Why are we finding these animals and these plants that don't exist in our world today? And yet they clearly did. They're just dead now. So at that time, the initial thought was, again, kind of related to religious texts here, that, oh, there must have been multiple periods of creation and destruction. So God would create a world and then destroy it, create a world and then destroy it. So people must currently be living in the most recent time of creation. And these were living things that must have existed during a older time of creation that unfortunately was destroyed. So there were people that were starting to challenge some of the thoughts of the community at the time. This was, again, before Darwin, that influenced Darwin into also going in what would be considered a radical direction. We had two geologists at the time that were working both separately and together, but they were investigating the world. A geologist tries to have an understanding of the earth and the earth's processes. Hutton and Lyell were looking at what were the processes that kind of shape the earth and how exactly did they work. So erosion, for example. In Hutton's texts, he realized that earth had to be more than just a few thousand years old due to how slowly geological processes occur. If erosion is an extremely slow process in many cases, then some of the vast examples of erosion, for example, the Grand Canyon, or the erosion that we see in mountains or other powerful rivers, that could not have been made in simply just a few thousand years. And Lyell had a text called Principles of Geology. He mentioned that these processes that we see shaping the earth today should also be the same processes that shaped the earth back in the past. And so that means earth had to at least be millions of years old, if not older. We now know the Earth is definitely older than a few thousand years old. So actually as old as billions. So even older than our scientists originally thought the Earth could be. And we know a little bit more about geology that is going to kind of influence our evolutionary theory here later on. So we know now, due to plate tectonics, another theory, another scientific theory, that Earth was actually, way back in the day, a large landmass that we call Pangaea. And due to plate tectonics, our continents have slowly shifted, slowly moved. Some can move as fast as 4 inches. Now, 4 inches doesn't really quite sound very fast, but if you're thinking of these large continental plates, that can be quite quick. But most move a little bit slower than 4 inches every year. But them constantly slowly moving causes them to change their position, so where they are in the earth, and also causes other geological features that you are very familiar with. So our earthquakes and our volcanoes are all partially due to these plates that are moving around on our earth. So, the earth is a lot older, and it's also quite a dynamic process. As for our Earth's history, and part of the reason why we find quite a bit of fossils of particular types due to certain time periods in our Earth's history, is due to the mass extinctions that we have had. In the past, there has been 5 what we call mass extinctions. So something that was happening in the earth at a global scale that caused a significant amount of death at that time. However, all of those common species that died at that time kind of allowed openings or windows for newer species to thrive, or for populations that kind of weren't on top at the time to blossom and to be the more common plant and animal population, since they were the survivors. And so each one, too, also allowed for new habitats to form. And this allowed, again, for the changing of new life for surviving species. Some of these mass extinctions have been caused by either rapid cooling or warming, changing of the sea levels. Many of you know of the asteroid impacts, volcanic activity. We have some, due to volcanic activity, we have changes in methane and CO2 levels that would cause quite a bit of death. And again, each one allowing for new habitats for the survivors, and thus resulting in those populations needing to change to adapt to those new environments. We had a couple other scientists at the time that, again, had some radical thinking, but Darwin used their ideas, some of their concepts, to, again, support his theory. Another man, Thomas Malthus, he actually was not necessarily a scientist per se. He was more so an economist, so someone that's studying the economy. And he was particularly focused, interested in, of course, people. And he observed that the human population was starting to get kind of big. And in particular, he was looking at London, how the population in London and other parts of Europe, they were starting to get quite a bit of people crammed in a small amount of space. And that was starting to cause some conflict at the time. And he started to wonder, like, what were these factors that would limit human population growth? So just how large could a human population get? And so Just like when we were talking about human population growth earlier in the year, as well as factors that limit the growth of plant and animal populations, he realized that populations of people will grow until eventually we start to run out of food or run out of space. And so that's where some of these factors are going to come in that's going to keep the population from growing longer. So, war amongst individuals for space or resources, or famine, not enough food, diseases, plagues being spread. These were all factors that would keep the population of people from growing exponentially forever. So Darwin used this to kind of ponder, okay, so what exactly were factors, limiting factors that kept animal populations from growing out of control? If we can see this happening in people, why can't this happen in plants and animals as well? Now our last one is very weird, very out there. However, we talk about this man for quite a few reasons. And again, you're going to find his ideas to be really funny, super, super obviously not true. However, we're going to point out why his thinking was important. So there's a man at the time named John Baptist Lamarck that noticed that plant and animal species were not, their populations were not fixed, that we did have different populations of different types of animals, and they look different and they have different things about them. And so he tried to come up with an explanation as to why. He was one of the first to do so before Darwin. Now, his idea is definitely a hypothesis. You'll find out why in a minute. But the whole idea behind his hypothesis is that by choosing to use or not use certain body parts, traits and abilities were passed down from parent to offspring. Now, this hypothesis had three big ideas to it. The first he called tendency towards perfection. Tendency towards perfection. And Lamarck said that living things will always try to become better, and they'll try to acquire traits that will allow them to become more successful. And so living things had the will or had the desire to try to be the best that they could be. And so one of his examples was birds and flying. He said that was quite likely that back in the day that birds initially could not fly. And so, of course, they were easily eaten by predators. And so birds realized they had to get off the ground in order to live. And so they started to try to fly. And they practiced flying, and over time, birds, because they had the will to fly, they were able to eventually fly. This obviously, though, doesn't quite apply, because that would also assume that if you really wanted to fly, that if you went home and practiced flying every day, that one day you could possibly fly. So please don't go home and start jumping off your roof practicing flying. Another part of his idea said that organisms acquire or lose traits based on how they use their body parts. An example that he had for this aspect of his idea were giraffes. He said that giraffes likely had small necks like most creatures do in the world. However, as food started to become harder to reach, they started to stretch their necks out to reach their food. And so over time, that constant stretching would make their necks longer. And that's how they became the long-necked individuals that they are today. And the last one was that traits were acquired are inherited. So if a parent altered its body in some way, the offspring would also have that alteration. So if you were a weightlifter and you lifted weights for most of your life and you were incredibly muscular, then that means your children would also have large muscles, just like you. And so, well, obviously, these ideas were very quickly discredited because we can observe that actively not happening. He was the first to begin thinking of the following ideas. And that's kind of why we credit him to helping Darwin to contribute to the theory of evolution because of the stuff he was thinking about. The first big idea is that a species is not fixed, or really that a population of species is not fixed. So he was one of the first to point out that, hey, living things do change over time. And while he had no idea about DNA or genetics, Gregor Mendel hadn't started going around experimenting with his pea plants yet, so there was no explanation of DNA, no rules in heredity. He was one of the first to really suggest that traits were inherited, that, hey, we can realize that offspring look quite a bit like their parents. And he also recognized, and this is going to be a really key point to evolution here, he recognized that adaptations, so qualities that living things have, are related to their environment and their success in their environment. So he realized that living things had certain characteristics about them that allowed them to be successful and that were related to their environment. Hey, giraffes have a long neck because their food, their environment is hard to reach. And so that allows them to successfully get the food. And not everything has a long neck because they don't need that for their environment. So this was a very key point, along with these other ideas, though, too, that as Darwin was reading ideas of other thinkers at the time, that Darwin also noticed as well. So knowing about these thinkers and their ideas, again, Darwin went on this voyage to help out with surveying for Her Majesty. He did not go on this voyage intentionally to come up with a theory to try to explain why living things are the way that they are and that living things change over time. That was not his intention. This was an idea that he happened to just kind of stumble upon based on his observations. Now we're going to just loosely touch what it was that he observed, and then we'll go way more in depth again throughout the quarter as to all the things that he saw and what that told him then and helped him with evidence for his evolutionary theory. So this is a 5-year voyage around the world. And while he was on the trip, Darwin collected a lot of plant and animal specimens that he observed and recorded in notebooks. So he either would do drawings or he would actually collect dead plants and animals, preserve them, and brought them back with him. And while he was traveling, he started to have some realizations during his travels. So some aha moments that had him starting to question nature and question our general understanding of nature. So he noticed that there was a larger diversity of plants and animals than he thought. He was just used to all the plants and animals that he saw in Europe. But he realized, wow, I had no idea that there were so many different types of birds, or that there were so many different types of mice, or so many different types of rabbits that existed in the world. He also noticed that there were some species that only lived in certain locations of the world, and they didn't live in other locations of the world where there were clearly habitats that could support those species. So, for example, at the time, he realized that when he was visiting Australia, that this would be an area that could really support rabbits. And yet, rabbits don't exist in Australia. Now, fun fact, rabbits are in Australia now, but they were actually brought over to Australia. They weren't naturally found there. And they're actually considered to be in some parts an invasive species because they are doing now so well. But at the time when Darwin visited Australia, there were no rabbits for him to see like he had in Europe. So he was like, well, that's kind of weird. And he also was starting to find fossils as well, just like many other people around the world. Just like many other people around the world, he started to wonder why they died and if they were related to similar species that were living today. He realized, okay, I don't know of any animal like this particular fossil that lives, this seashell I found, but yet this shell looks a lot like other shells that do exist today. So why do I have this shell here that does not exist today, but I have these other examples of shells that are very similar that do exist today? So again, while he was traveling all over the world and had many realizations all over the world, his most influential spot was the Galapagos Islands. Now, the Galapagos Islands, these are a small group of islands that are located a little west of South America. And even though the islands are very close together, due to their location, some are a little bit farther north or farther south than others, but due to their location as well as to ocean currents, they do have very different habitats. Islands that were smaller and that were lower in our latitude, they were very dry and barren, so they didn't have a lot of vegetation, not a lot of plants. Where islands higher up had a lot of rainfall and also had quite a bit of vegetation. Now, there were two populations of animals that he noticed that really got him thinking and was kind of the driving force behind his evolutionary theory. The first were the tortoises of the island. And while talking with the locals, he found it really interesting that a local could tell you what island a certain tortoise came from, what island a particular tortoise lived on, based on how the tortoise looked. Darwin found that even though these tortoises looked very much alike, they had some vast differences between the two that were related to their environment. Some tortoises had very long necks, and they had these shells that were flatter, And these tortoises here with these very long necks were only found on the islands that were very dry and barren, and where the food was found primarily on tall bushes or short trees. And so Darwin realized that these tortoises used their long necks as a way to obtain food on that island that they lived on. The tortoises that had these very tiny necks and their shells were very domed and left it kind of difficult for them to really even stretch their necks out. These tortoises were found on the islands that had a lot of rainfall and on the islands that had a lot of vegetation that was low to the ground. And he realized that these tortoises didn't eat from tall trees like this one. These tortoises instead ate on the ground. And so that kind of Darwin thinking on why do we have two different types of tortoises, and why does one have a long neck that allows it to be better suited for its environment, and the other has a short neck that allows it to be better suited for its environment. Another observation that we'll use quite a bit, and we'll go a little bit more in detail with, are the finches that are on the Galapagos Island. So there are now currently at least 13 species of finches found on the Galapagos Island, each one filling a different niche, which it's been a while since we talked about a niche. A niche is just your place or role in nature. And they all have a different niche, a different role on these different islands. Now, it's our understanding, based on our knowledge of the DNA history of these finches, that all of them evolved or changed from one ancestral species that colonized the island a few million years ago. So that one species, that population of finch over time changed to these 13 different species of finches, all of which have adapted to have a different beak to allow them to adapt for different diets. This, in a way, reduces competition, so we can have more finches in an area because they're not eating the same food, they're eating different food. And it opens up more food sources, too, for all of those species. So Darwin realized there's all these different finches on the island, and they all have their own food source. So they're super similar to each other aside from their beaks. And some had beaks that were better adapted to eat seeds. Others had beaks that were sharper to tear open fruit. Others were pointier to get at insects. Some finches only used tools to obtain food. They didn't really use their beaks a whole lot. And so that also got Darwin thinking, why was there kind of a need in nature to have all of these different types of finches? And why did they develop this way? So tomorrow we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the premise of evolution. So how exactly do living things change over time? And we'll also go a little bit more in depth too with the evidence that supports evolutionary theory. So what have we seen? What have we observed? What's all the different types of evidence that we've collected that shows that living things do indeed change over time? A population is not fixed. That is going to be it for our notes today.